I tasted candle smoke and scandal in the same breath. 1,000 lights burned above me like witnesses, and every gaze felt like a verdict I could not appeal. When a gloved hand brushed mine, the room fell away. The music, the whispers, even my name. Before dawn, someone will speak the truth, the kind that does not return what was taken but unmakes the lie that stole it. If courage has a sound, it is the breath I take now, because the next one may cost me everything. The hand was Lord Alistair Ashworth's. I knew it without looking, the way one knows the feel of coming rain or the stillness before a storm. He was a man made of winter and silence, a recluse who had not been seen in London's society for years, and his sudden appearance at Lord Beaumont's annual ball was a mystery that had set every tongue to wagging. His touch was not a comfort, not yet. It was an anchor, a quiet, firm pressure at my wrist that kept me from floating away on the sea of accusation that was rising around me. Miss Vance, Lord Beaumont's voice, usually so full of false bonhomie, was sharp as shattered glass. He stood on the raised dais, a letter held aloft in his hand. The candlelight glinted on the broken wax seal, a small red wound. A most unfortunate discovery has been made this evening. A matter of a forged correspondence, leading to a significant financial decision on my part. He did not need to name me. Every eye in that gilded ballroom, from the dowagers on the settees to the young ladies by the punch bowl, turned to me. I was the humble companion to his wife, the daughter of a merchant whose recent misfortunes were common gossip. I was the perfect suspect, a weed in their immaculate garden. The whispers grew from a murmur to a hiss, the sound of silk and condemnation. Liar, forger, thief. Have you ever felt the world shrink to the size of a single damning word? My own breath caught, a knot of ice in my throat. My father's honor, my own future, all of it was unraveling under the weight of 1,000 glittering chandeliers. I could feel the heat on my cheeks, the cold dread coiling in my stomach. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to declare my innocence. But what good would it do? My word against his, in his home, surrounded by his world. It was then that Lord Ashworth moved. He did not speak, did not challenge Lord Beaumont. He simply stepped forward, placing himself partially in front of me, a subtle shield of black wool and unyielding presence. He inclined his head toward the French doors that led to the terrace. It was not a command, but an offering, an escape. I took it, my feet moving numbly across the polished floor as he escorted me from the room, the collective gasp of the assembly following us like a wave. Outside, the cool night air was a mercy. The scent of rain-washed roses from the Beaumont's manicured gardens filled my lungs. He released my wrist, and the absence of his touch left me feeling strangely adrift. He still had not spoken a word to me. His profile was carved from granite in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. "My lord," I managed, my voice a raw whisper, "I do not know how to thank you, or why you would—" "I have no interest in Beaumont's parlor games," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges as if from disuse, "and I have even less interest in witnessing a public execution." He looked at me then, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky. They held no pity, only a keen, unnerving assessment. "You should leave. Now, before his wife remembers her duty and has you thrown out." He was right. My position, my life in this house was over. He turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the shadows of the terrace as if he had never been there at all. I was left alone with the ruins of my reputation and the scent of roses I could no longer appreciate. By morning I was dismissed. Lady Beaumont, her face a mask of pained disappointment, could not even meet my eyes as she instructed the butler to see me out. I packed my single trunk, my hands shaking as I folded the simple gowns that felt like the uniform of a life that no longer belonged to me. My father, when I sent him a frantic note, wrote back in a script made unsteady by despair. He believed me, but his belief was a candle in a hurricane. Lord Beaumont's accusation had already done its work, closing doors throughout the city. No one would hire a companion, a governess, a secretary with the stain of forgery upon her name. For a week I lived in a haze of fear, my meager savings dwindling with each passing day. I sat in my small rented room, watching the rain streak down the window pane, each drop a reflection of my own unshed tears. The city felt like a prison, every carriage that passed a potential bearer of more bad news. I was trapped, with no recourse and no hope. Then the letter came. It was delivered by a private courier, a single heavy sheet of cream parchment sealed with a severe black wax crest, a wolf's head, the sigil of the House of Ashworth. My heart hammered against my ribs as I broke the seal. The handwriting within was bold and spare, as uncompromising as the man himself. It was not a letter of condolence or an offer of charity. It was a proposal of employment. Lord Ashworth required an archivist to catalog the extensive and notoriously disorganized library of his late father. The work, he stated, would be arduous and would require absolute discretion. I would reside at his country estate, Blackwood Hall, and my duties would be confined to the library and its adjacent chambers. He would expect no social interaction. The salary he offered was more than generous. It was a lifeline. A choice was before me: to remain in London and starve with my tattered dignity, or to accept a position that felt suspiciously like a gilded cage, offered by a man who was a complete enigma. I chose the cage. What, after all, did I have left to lose? 2 days later, a carriage bearing the same wolf's head crest collected me and my trunk. We left the smog and whispers of London behind, traveling north into a landscape of rolling hills and ancient forests. As the carriage turned onto a long, winding drive, I caught my first glimpse of Blackwood Hall. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a severe, beautiful house of dark gray stone, flanked by 2 imposing wings, its many windows like watchful eyes. The house seemed to rise from the mist-shrouded earth, more fortress than home. The gardens, unlike the pristine beds at the Beaumont residence, were wild and overgrown. Roses grew in tangled thickets, their thorny branches reaching like desperate arms. It was a place that had given up on being tamed. A woman as severe as the house itself met me at the door. Her name was Mrs. Gable, and her face was a roadmap of disciplined sorrows. She did not smile. She simply acknowledged my existence with a curt nod. "Miss Vance, his lordship is not in residence today. He left instructions." Her voice was starched, every word ironed flat. "Your duties are confined to the library wing. Your meals will be brought to your rooms. You are not to wander." It was the welcome of a jailer, not a housekeeper. I followed her through a great hall where the portraits of past Ashworths watched from the shadows, their painted eyes seeming to track my every move. The air was cold, still, and smelled of beeswax, old stone, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of rain on dry earth. We ascended a wide, curving staircase, our footsteps the only sound in the suffocating silence. "His lordship values his privacy above all else," Mrs. Gable continued, as if sensing my unspoken questions. "He will not be disturbed. You will likely not see him at all. Your instructions for the library are on the desk in your study." My study was a small antechamber connected to the main library, furnished with a sturdy desk, a single chair, and a narrow cot in an adjoining room. It was monastic but clean. A single tall window looked out over the back of the house, offering a view of the tangled rose garden. The thorns were more prominent than the blooms, a thicket of beautiful, dangerous things left to their own devices. It felt like a reflection of the master of the house himself. Then she opened the door to the library, and I forgot to breathe. It was not one room, but a cathedral of books. 2 stories high, with a gallery running along the upper level, it was a magnificent, heartbreaking chaos. Books were stacked on every surface, spilling from shelves, piled in corners, their spines cracked and their pages whispering with dust. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, streamed through a high-arched window, illuminating the beautiful disarray. It was the tomb of a great mind, a treasure left to ruin. The task was not arduous, it was biblical. For 3 days I saw no one but the young maid who silently delivered my meal trays. I spent my hours in that vast, quiet room, a castaway on an island of paper and ink. I began by simply walking the perimeter, trying to grasp the scale of the collection. History, philosophy, poetry in a dozen languages, scientific treatises, and endless rows of estate ledgers. It was the history of a family, a legacy in leather and vellum. On the 4th day, while clearing a high shelf of what appeared to be agricultural records, My fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. It was not a book. Tucked behind a row of dull brown ledgers was a small box made of polished rosewood, inlaid with a mother-of-pearl initial, a single elegant E. It was locked and far too personal to be part of a formal collection. It felt like a secret. I placed it on a nearby table, my curiosity a small, bright spark in the dusty silence. That evening, I worked late, driven by a need to impose some small order on the chaos as if it might bring order to my own life. The library was cavernous in the dark, the small pool of my candlelight a fragile defense against the encroaching shadows. The house was utterly still. Have you ever been in a silence so profound you can hear the beating of your own heart? A floorboard creaked on the gallery above me. I froze, my hand hovering over a page. I was not alone. I looked up into the darkness, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows at the top of the stairs. It was Lord Ashworth. He descended without a sound, his movements fluid and silent. He was not dressed for society now. He wore simple dark trousers and a linen shirt, unbuttoned at the throat. He looked younger, less formidable, and profoundly weary. The weight of the silence in his house seemed to rest on his shoulders. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the books around us. "You keep late hours." "The work requires it, my lord." My voice was steadier than I felt. "The collection is extensive." "My father was a man of compulsive intellect and zero organizational skill," he stated, his gaze sweeping the room. There was no apology in his tone, only a flat statement of fact. His eyes, those winter gray eyes, came to rest on me. "You have not been disturbed?" "No, my lord, Mrs. Gable has been most efficient." An almost imperceptible softening occurred around his mouth. Not quite a smile, but a lessening of tension. "She is a fortress and loyal." His gaze drifted to the table where I had been working, and he saw the rosewood box. I saw him still, just for a second. A sharp intake of breath, so quiet it was more felt than heard. A shudder came down over his face, his expression becoming guarded, remote. He said nothing of it, but the air between us thickened with unspoken history. He turned to go. "My lord," I said, the word escaping before I could stop it. He paused, his back to me. "The letter Lord Beaumont read at the ball, the one I was accused of forging. Did you see it?" He turned slowly. The candlelight carved his face into sharp planes and deep shadows. "I did." "And did you believe it was my hand?" He considered me for a long, unnerving moment. "No," he said finally. "The penmanship was too florid. It lacked discipline. It was the work of someone trying to imitate an elegant hand, not someone who possesses one." He turned and ascended the stairs, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had come, leaving me with the echo of his words and a new, unsettling question. How did a man who had not spoken 10 words to me know the character of my handwriting? The days bled into a week, then 2. I developed a rhythm, a quiet life lived within the walls of that library. The work was my solace. The stories in those books were a world away from my own ruined one. I began to feel a strange sense of ownership, of purpose. I was not a companion or a guest. I was a scholar, a guardian of this forgotten legacy. I learned the history of the Ashworths through their own words. I found journals of grand tours, letters from foreign courts, and the dry, meticulous estate ledgers that chronicled the family's fortunes. It was in one of these ledgers, from 2 decades prior, that I found the first thread of the truth. Tucked within its pages was a sheaf of letters, bound with a faded blue ribbon. They were correspondence between Lord Ashworth's father, the old Duke, and Lord Beaumont's father. The early letters were cordial, detailing shared investments and social engagements. But as I read on, the tone grew strained. The last 2 letters were different. They concerned a significant debt owed by Beaumont to Ashworth. I held one of the last letters closer to the candlelight, my blood running cold. The signature was Lord Beaumont's, but the elegant, looping script was subtly different from the earlier correspondence. It was more ornate, more florid. It was a near-perfect match to the forgery that had ruined me. A lie has a history. It is not born in a moment of scandal. It is grown in the dark, from older seeds. This was not about me. I had simply been the most convenient scapegoat in a feud that had been simmering for a generation. My disgrace was a move in a much larger, more dangerous game. As this realization settled over me, a storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain lashed against the high-arched windows, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the great house. A draft snaked its way through the library, and the flame of my candle guttered, casting frantic shadows across the walls. I felt a profound chill, one that had nothing to do with the weather. I gathered the damning letters, my hands trembling slightly, and retreated to the relative warmth of my small study. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the turmoil in my heart. To be innocent was one thing. To be a pawn was another entirely. It was a deeper, more calculated cruelty. Later that evening, long after the storm had passed into a steady, hushed rain, I returned to my rooms to find that someone had been there. A fire had been built in the small hearth, its cheerful crackle a welcome sound in the quiet. On the table beside my chair sat a tray with a steaming pot of tea, a cup and saucer, and a plate of Mrs. Gable's shortbread cookies. The gesture was so at odds with the severe, silent house that it felt like a dream. It was an offering of warmth in a place that had none. I poured the tea, my hands cupped around the porcelain for its heat. The firelight danced on the walls, making the shadows retreat. Someone had entered my private space, my sanctuary of work and solitude, and left behind a quiet act of grace. It could only have been him. Mrs. Gable was a creature of duty, not of impulse. This was the work of a man who moved in shadows, a man who had anchored me in a storm and then offered me a harbor, however forbidding its shores. I sat for a long time, watching the flames, the letters from the past lying on my desk like sleeping vipers. I was a pawn, yes, but a pawn on whose side? Lord Ashworth had rescued me, employed me, and now it seemed was tending to my comfort in some small, silent way. But his motives remained as veiled as the portraits in the Great Hall. He had placed me in the heart of his family's history, in this library of secrets, and left me to my work. Was it a test, or was he simply waiting for me to find what he already suspected was there? Have you ever placed your faith in a silence, hoping it held a promise? The next morning, the world outside was washed clean by the storm. Droplets of rain clung to the window pane like jewels, and the overgrown rose garden was a riot of deep, wet green and bruised crimson petals. The thorns glistened, beautiful and sharp. I saw him then, for the briefest of moments. Lord Ashworth was walking the tangled paths below, his head bowed against the wind. He paused beside a particularly wild thicket of roses, his hand hovering over a bloom before he seemed to think better of it and continued on, a solitary figure in his own domain. Seeing him there, in that unguarded moment, solidified a resolve in me. I was not content to be a piece in a game I did not understand. I returned to the library, my purpose clear. My eyes fell upon the rosewood box. The initial E glinted in the morning light. The box was a secret, just like the letters, a personal history tucked away behind the public record of ledgers. It felt connected, a part of the same story. I ran my fingers over the desk where I had found it, searching for any other anomaly. My fingertips caught on a slight unevenness in the wood at the back of a deep drawer. Pressing gently, I heard a soft click. A false bottom lifted, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside lay a single, tarnished silver key, delicate and ornate. It was a key that belonged to a private world, not to the grand machinery of an estate. With a trembling hand, I carried it to the rosewood box. It fit the lock perfectly. I turned it, the mechanism yielding with a quiet sigh, and lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and old paper rose to meet me. Inside, there were no jewels, no coins. There was only a child's lock of soft, brown hair tied with a ribbon, a collection of pressed flowers, and a small, leather-bound diary. The embossed gold on the cover read, Eleonora Ashworth. It was his mother's. I sank into the chair, the diary feeling both sacred and heavy in my hands. To read it felt like a trespass, yet to leave it unread felt like a betrayal of the truth I was seeking. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was fine and elegant, a script that spoke of a gentle, thoughtful nature. The early entries were full of light, her love for her husband, her joy in her young son, Alistair, and her passion for the gardens of Blackwood Hall. She was the one who had planted the roses. I turned the pages, my heart aching with a sense of loss for this woman I had never known. Then I found the entries I was looking for. 20 years ago, a visit from Lord and Lady Beaumont. Eleanora wrote of Lady Beaumont as a nervous, unhappy woman, trapped in a difficult marriage. In a moment of shared confidence in the garden, Lady Beaumont had confessed her husband's mounting debts and his increasing desperation. Eleanora's entry was filled with a sad pity, but also a sharp, clear-eyed assessment of Lord Beaumont's character. "He has the ambition of a king," she wrote, "but the honor of a thief." The next entry, a week later, was a thunderclap. Lord Beaumont had returned alone. He had twisted his wife's desperate confession into a weapon, attempting to blackmail the Duke. He threatened to spread rumors about the Duke's own investments, to create a scandal that would tarnish the Ashworth name unless the Duke forgave the debt and extended him another, larger loan. The Duke, a man of unbending principle, had refused and shown him the door. The feud was not about debt, it was about extortion, it was about honor. Alistair saw it all. The final entry on the matter read, "He was only a boy, but he was standing in the hall. I saw the look on his face. He understood the nature of the insult. I fear this poison will linger in him." The poison had lingered. It had shaped him into the silent, watchful man he had become. And now I held the antidote in my hands. The diary, combined with the letters, was not just proof of my innocence. It was the story of a long, calculated injustice against his family. I closed the diary, my course set. I did not wait for him to appear in the library again. I took the letters, the diary, and a single lit candle to light my way through the darkening corridors of the house. I found him in a small study I had not seen before, a room that was clearly his private retreat. A portrait of a beautiful, serene woman with kind eyes, Eleanora, hung over the mantelpiece. He was standing before the fire, lost in thought, the very picture of the lonely boy in his mother's diary. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable. He showed no surprise, only a quiet expectation, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low. I did not answer. I walked to the heavy oak table that stood between us and placed the items upon it, the bound letters, the rosewood box, the open diary. The candlelight flickered across his face as his gaze fell upon his mother's things. For a fleeting second, I saw not the master of the house, but the boy who had witnessed his family's honor betrayed. The mask of indifference slipped, revealing a deep, ancient hurt. When he finally looked at me, his winter gray eyes were raw with a pain he had carried for 2 decades. "Why did you bring me here, my lord?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was a frantic bird in my chest. "You knew who forged that letter. You knew from the beginning." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the diary. "I did not know for certain," he said at last, his voice rough. "But I have suspected Beaumont of being a man capable of anything to secure his fortune. My father's ledgers showed the debt, but not the reason for the enmity that followed. He never spoke of it. He simply closed himself off. And you," I said, my voice softer now, a thread of sound in the fire-warmed quiet. "You did the same." The truth of it hung between us, stark and undeniable. He did not flinch from it. He met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw the full depth of the wound he carried. It was not the anger of a wronged nobleman, but the profound, abiding sorrow of a son who had watched his mother's world dim and his father's heart harden. "When you collapsed my world at the Beaumont's ball," I continued, my own voice gaining a strength I did not know I possessed, "you did not just see a convenient pawn. You saw an opportunity. You brought me here, to this library, to this house of ghosts. You surrounded me with the past. You were waiting for me to find this, weren't you?" "I was hoping," he corrected, his voice raspy with emotion. He finally moved, walking around the table until he stood near me, though he did not touch me. His nearness was a palpable force, a gravity that drew all the air from the room. I hoped that someone with a sense of order, with a respect for the truth, might see the patterns I could not. I have lived with the ghost of this story my whole life, but I was too close to it. I saw only the pain, not the proof. But why me? I pressed the question that had echoed in the silence of my lonely rooms for weeks. There are 100 disgraced companions in London, 1,000 scholars you could have hired. Why choose the one person at the very center of Beaumont's new lie? He looked away from me then, toward the portrait of his mother. The firelight softened the lines of her face, giving her an expression of gentle, living wisdom. Because it was not a new lie, he said, so quietly I had to strain to hear him. It was the same lie, dressed in new clothes. He turned back to me, and his eyes held an intensity that pinned me in place. The forged letter Beaumont held up at the ball, it was not an imitation of your hand, Miss Vance. It was a crude imitation of my mother's. The room tilted, the air grew thin, grew. The 1,000 books surrounding us seemed to lean in, their leather spines like silent, waiting judges. Everything I thought I knew about my own scandal was wrong. It was never about me. It was a desecration. Years ago, he continued, his voice a low, taut line of fury and grief. After his attempt at extortion failed, Beaumont tried another tactic. He forged a letter supposedly from my mother to his wife, filled with false confessions of indiscretion. He intended to use it to ruin her reputation, but he misjudged my father. The Duke intercepted it, recognized the forgery immediately, and threatened Beaumont with a ruin so complete he would never recover. Beaumont retreated, but the insult was never forgotten. I was 10 years old. I saw the letter. I never forgot the look of it. He took a step closer. When I saw the letter that night at the ball, I saw the same ghost, the same florid, desperate script. He was using my mother's memory to attack you. He chose you, Miss Vance, because your own integrity, your quiet dignity, was a reflection of hers. And in his twisted mind, destroying you was a way of finally succeeding at the crime he failed to commit 20 years ago. A terrible, clarifying light broke over me. I was not a random victim. I was a proxy, an effigy of the woman in the portrait, chosen for a symbolic execution. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unable to support the weight of this revelation. Have you ever felt the story of your life dissolve, only to find it was a chapter in someone else's much older, sadder tale? And my handwriting, I whispered, looking up at him. I saw it once, he admitted, a faint flush rising on his neck. A note you left for Lady Beaumont regarding her schedule. It was on her desk. It was disciplined, clear, honorable. It reminded me of her. He gestured toward the diary. When I saw you standing there at the ball, so alone, and I knew what Beaumont was doing, I decided I would not let him succeed. I brought you here not just to find proof, but to protect the one person who he had unwittingly chosen to stand in my mother's place. He had not saved me from scandal. He had saved me for a purpose. He had placed his family's honor, his mother's memory, into my hands, trusting that I would know what to do with it. The weight of that trust was heavier than any accusation, more binding than any contract of employment. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice clear now, stripped of all fear. The question seemed to release him from his own prison of memory. The tension in his shoulders eased. He looked at me, not as an employer, not as a recluse, but as a man asking for help. Help me unmake the lie, he said simply. Help me give my mother's memory peace and restore the honor to your name that Beaumont tried to steal. The word we was not spoken, but it was there. It settled in the space between us, a silent vow. We were no longer Lord Ashworth and Miss Vance. We were Alistair and Clara, two solitary souls bound by a shared enemy and a common cause. For the next hour, we sat at that table, the fire casting long shadows on the walls, and we laid our plans. The diary was too personal, too sacred to be shown in a public court of opinion. The old letters were damning, but it was one man's word against another's, a generation removed. It was not enough. There was a witness to my father's confrontation with Beaumont, Alistair said, his fingers steepled before him. My mother's lady's maid, Mrs. Albright, she was devoted to my mother. She was standing just outside the study door when Beaumont was thrown out. She heard everything. Where is she now? She retired to a small cottage in the Lake District years ago. My father provided her with a generous pension. I have not seen her since I was a boy, but she would remember. Her loyalty was absolute. Then you must go to her, I said. You must get her testimony. And you? He asked, his gaze searching mine. I will remain here, I said, my hand resting on the open diary. I will go through my own letters, my own records. Beaumont was careless. He assumed I was a powerless girl with no history worth examining. He was wrong. There may be something, some small detail in my correspondence with Lady Beaumont that corroborates this. I looked at the letters on the table, the old and the new. He used a letter to create a lie. It seems fitting that we should use them to reveal the truth. A sense of profound calm settled over me. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. I was no longer a victim adrift in a sea of scandal. I was a strategist, a keeper of secrets, a woman with a righteous fight before her. Alistair rose, and I with him. The air between us was different now, charged with shared intent. I will leave at dawn, he said. It will take me the better part of a week to travel there and back. Be careful, Alistair, I said, the use of his given name feeling as natural as breathing. Clara, he replied, and the sound of my name on his lips was a promise. His hand lifted as if to touch my cheek, but he let it fall. The unspoken gesture was more intimate than any touch. Guard the truth until I return. He left me then, a shadow moving through the silent house. I remained in his study, the fire burning low, the portrait of Alistair Ashworth watching over me. I felt her presence in that room, a gentle strength, a quiet approval. I was not just fighting for myself, I was fighting for her. The week of his absence was the longest of my life. The silence of Blackwood Hall, once a comfort, now felt like a held breath. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of wind in the chimney made me start. I worked by the light of a single candle. My world shrunk to the circle of its glow. The great library was a sea of shadows around me, the spines of 1,000 books like silent sentinels. I sorted through the meager collection of my own letters, the ones I had written and received during my tenure with the Beaumonts. They were mostly dry, functional things, notes about schedules, lists of errands, polite inquiries after health. I was searching for a ghost, a faint echo of the truth I now knew. Mrs. Gable maintained the house with a discipline that bordered on monastic. Meals appeared on my study desk at precise hours. The fire was lit before I felt the chill, and yet I rarely saw another living soul. The silence was a constant companion, a presence as real as the books themselves. In that quiet, I felt the weight of Alistair's trust. He had left his family's honor in my hands, a fragile thing wrapped in the dusty pages of his mother's diary. On the third day of his absence, I found it. It was not a confession, not a smoking gun, but a small, sharp crack in the facade of Lord Beaumont's world. It was a letter from Lady Beaumont, written nearly a year ago, canceling a planned trip to the seaside. Her official reason was a sudden illness, but tucked into the closing pleasantries was a line I had skimmed over at the time, my mind on packing lists and travel arrangements. My husband's unfortunate speculations have left us in a state of some retrenchment, she had written. He is not himself of late. Unfortunate speculations. The phrase was a delicate euphemism, a silken glove covering a desperate financial reality. I checked the date against Eleanor's diary. It was within the same season that Lord Beaumont's father had first approached the old Duke for a loan, the beginning of the debt that had festered into blackmail and ruin. It was a thread, thin but strong, connecting the past to the present. It proved a pattern of behavior, a history of reckless ambition. A soft knock at the door made me jump, the letter rattling in my hand. It was not the usual silent delivery. I opened it to find a young maid I had not seen before, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Miss Vance, she began, bobbing a quick curtsy. Mrs. Gable sent me with your tea. She's seeing to the linen stores. Thank you, I said, taking the tray. The girl lingered, her eyes wide as she took in the magnificent chaos of the library. It's a grand place, isn't it, miss? She whispered as if the books themselves might overhear. The things they say in the village, about his lordship, that he's a hermit, that he never sees no one. But you're here. A cold knot of apprehension formed in my stomach. I am here to work, that is all, I said, my tone cooler than I intended. Oh, I know, miss, she said quickly, intimidated. It's a bit of a story is all. A pretty young lady like yourself, all alone in this big house with the sad lord." She blushed a deeper crimson. "Forgive me, miss, I talk too much. My mother says my tongue will be the death of me." She hurried away, leaving me with a tray of cooling tea and a growing sense of dread. A bit of a story. The poison of gossip did not require a ballroom or a grand accusation. It could begin with a careless word in a village market, a whisper from a maid whose tongue ran away with her. Beaumont did not need to know where I was. He only needed to hear the story, and he would put the pieces together. The library, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. The high, arched windows that had seemed so beautiful now felt like eyes watching me from the world outside. I spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert, my work on the letters forgotten. I was listening, waiting for the sound of a carriage on the gravel drive, a sound that would mean Alistair had returned. The next day, needing air, I ventured into the overgrown gardens. Eleanora's roses had been left to their own devices for years, and they had grown into a magnificent, thorny wilderness. Deep crimson blooms fought for space with pale pink ones, their scent a heady mix of sweetness and decay. It was a garden that had learned to survive on its own, beautiful but armed against intrusion. I reached out to touch a perfect, blood-red rose, and a thorn pricked my finger. A single bright drop of blood welled on my skin. I understood then, in a way I hadn't before, why Alistair had never tamed this place. It was a monument to his mother, not to her memory but to her spirit, a spirit that was both gentle and resilient. It was a place of beautiful, dangerous things left to their own devices. Have you ever felt a kinship with a place so deep it feels like a memory you did not live? I felt Eleanora's presence there, in the whisper of the wind through the thorny canes, and I felt a surge of strength. I was not a fragile bloom to be trampled. I had thorns of my own. I was returning to the house when I heard it, the distinct crunch of wheels on the drive. My heart leaped with a desperate hope. Alistair, he was back early. I hurried to the front hall, my steps echoing in the cavernous space. I reached the tall windows beside the main door just as the carriage came into view. It was not Alistair's. It was a fashionable, lacquered carriage, its panels bearing the crest of a family I recognized with a sickening lurch of my stomach. The Trowbridges. Lady Trowbridge was a notorious gossip, a woman whose social influence was built entirely on the misfortunes of others. She was one of Lady Beaumont's closest confidants. I watched, frozen, as the footman opened the door. Lady Trowbridge emerged, her face a perfect mask of contrived distress. She looked up at the imposing facade of Blackwood Hall as if she had stumbled upon a Gothic ruin in the middle of a pleasant country drive. This was no accident. This was an attack. Mrs. Gable was there before I could even think to move. She opened the great oak door just as Lady Trowbridge was about to lift the heavy iron knocker. Her posture was an unyielding wall of propriety. "My lady," Mrs. Gable said, her voice devoid of any warmth or surprise, "you are a long way from London." "Mrs. Gable, is it?" Lady Trowbridge said, feigning a vague recollection. "My dear woman, you must help me. My carriage has thrown a wheel just down the lane. A most unfortunate accident. I saw the roof of this house through the trees and hoped I might beg a moment's shelter while my driver sees to the repairs." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was no damaged wheel. This was a reconnaissance mission, a foray behind enemy lines. "His lordship is not in residence," Mrs. Gable stated flatly. "Oh, what a pity," Lady Trowbridge said, her eyes already scanning the hall behind the housekeeper, searching. "But surely you wouldn't turn away a lady in distress." "A cup of tea is all I ask. The shock has left me quite faint." She made to step over the threshold, but Mrs. Gable did not move. It was a silent, magnificent battle of wills. But I knew we could not refuse her. To do so would only create more suspicion, more talk. I stepped forward from the shadows. "Of course you must come in, Lady Trowbridge," I said, my voice calm and even. "We would not dream of leaving you stranded." Lady Trowbridge's eyes widened in feigned theatrical shock as they landed on me. "Miss Vance! Good heavens! What on earth are you doing here?" "I am employed here, my lady," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching, "as an archivist for Lord Ashworth's library." "An archivist?" she repeated, the word dripping with insinuation. She stepped into the hall, her gaze sweeping over my simple work dress, then around the grand silent space. How remarkable. After the terrible business at the Beaumonts, one wondered where you might have found refuge. It seems you have landed on your feet indeed. The unspoken accusation was as clear as if she had shouted it, that I had fled one scandal only to create a new, more flagrant one, hiding myself away as the mistress of a reclusive lord. Mrs. Gable, I said, turning to the housekeeper, would you be so kind as to show her ladyship to the drawing room and bring her the tea she requested? I must return to my work. I would not give her the satisfaction of an audience. I would not allow her to interrogate me. I gave her a polite, distant nod, turned and walked away, my back straight, feeling her venomous gaze follow me up the grand staircase. I did not run. I did not run. I did not give her the satisfaction of my fear. I returned to the library and closed the heavy oak doors behind me, the sound a dull thud of finality. The silence I had once found so peaceful now felt charged, thin, like the air before a lightning strike. I could not work. I stood at the tall window that overlooked the drive, my fingers gripping the cold stone of the sill, and I waited. Downstairs I could hear the faint, high-pitched murmur of Lady Trowbridge's voice, punctuated by the occasional monosyllabic rumble of Mrs. Gable's replies. It was a siege in miniature. Lady Trowbridge was probing for weakness, for a crack in the fortress walls through which her poison could seep. But Mrs. Gable was a fortress herself, her loyalty as solid as the stone of Blackwood Hall. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 20 minutes, I saw Lady Trowbridge emerge from the front door. Her posture was stiff with indignation. Her ruse had failed. She had found no weeping, hysterical girl, no evidence of a sordid affair, only a quiet archivist and an immovable housekeeper. She climbed into her carriage, the footman closing the door with a sharp snap, and the carriage rolled away down the drive, carrying its cargo of insinuation back to London. The war had begun. That evening, when the maid brought my dinner tray, there was an extra item upon it, a single perfect crimson rose in a slender crystal vase. There was no note. None was needed. It was a message from Mrs. Gable, a silent acknowledgement of the battle we had just faced together. It was a gesture of solidarity, as beautiful and as thorny as the garden from which it had come. The next 2 days were a blur of anxious waiting. The story would be spreading through the drawing rooms of London like a fever. I could picture it clearly. The whispered conversations behind feathered fans, the knowing glances, the slow, deliberate destruction of my character and Alistair's. He had brought me here to protect me, and instead, I had brought the battle to his very door. On the afternoon of the 7th day of his absence, the sky turned the color of slate. A wind rose, rattling the window frames and moaning in the chimneys. The first drops of rain fell, then a torrent lashing against the glass in a furious, cleansing wave. The storm I had felt brewing within me had finally broken over the world outside, and through the driving rain, I saw it, a dark carriage pulled by 2 powerful horses, moving at a determined pace up the long drive. It was him. I flew down the stairs, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I did not care for propriety, for the watchful eyes of the ancestral portraits. I reached the great hall just as the front door swung open, admitting a gust of wind and rain, and the tall, drenched figure of Alistair Ashworth. He stopped on the threshold, his traveling cloak dripping onto the flagstones, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked exhausted, his face etched with weariness, but his eyes, those winter gray eyes, burned with a fierce, triumphant light as they found mine. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "You're back," I breathed, the relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. He shed his wet cloak, handing it to Mrs. Gable, who had appeared as if from nowhere, her face a mask of disciplined calm. "Mrs. Gable," he said with a nod, "see that a fire is lit in my study, and bring us brandy. We have work to do." He did not wait for a reply, but turned to me, his hand taking my elbow in a firm, possessive grip. "Come in it," he said, and led me not to the library but to his private study, the room where I had first shown him the diary. The fire was already catching, its flames chasing the damp chill from the room. He walked to the hearth, his back to me, staring into the blaze as if seeking an answer in its depths. The rain beat a relentless rhythm against the window panes. Have you ever stood in a room with someone whose silence holds the entire weight of your future? Did you find her? I finally asked, my voice a whisper. He turned from the fire. His face was stark in the flickering light. I did, he said. She is an old woman now, frail, but her mind is as sharp as a shard of glass, and her memory is perfect. He crossed the room to his desk, took a key from his waistcoat pocket, and unlocked a small leather document case. From it, he withdrew a single sheet of folded parchment. It was not old. The ink was fresh, the paper crisp. He laid it on the table between us. She remembered everything, he said, his voice low and intense. The argument, the threats, Beaumont's rage when my father ordered him from the house. She even remembered the look on my face as I watched from the stairs. He paused, his hand resting on the document. But she offered more than her memory. My gaze was fixed on the parchment. What is it? After the confrontation, my mother was deeply distressed. Not for herself, but for what she saw in my father. She saw the beginning of his retreat from the world. That night she wrote him a letter, a plea. She begged him not to let one man's dishonor poison their lives, not to build walls around his heart. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. He never saw it. She gave it to Mrs. Albright for safekeeping, to be given to him when his anger had cooled. But it never did. He closed the door to that part of his life, and my mother, respecting his grief, never asked for the letter back. Mrs. Albright has kept it all these years, a final, unspoken piece of my mother's heart. He unfolded the parchment. It was not the original letter. It was a sworn affidavit signed by a solicitor from the village near Mrs. Albright's home. In it, she recounted the events of that day 20 years ago in precise, unshakable detail. And attached to it, sealed within a protective oilskin pouch, was the letter itself. Eleanora's elegant, disciplined hand, a silent testament to her grace and foresight. It was more than proof. It was a resurrection. It was Eleanora's voice reaching across 2 decades of silence to unmake the lie. She gave it to you? I whispered, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch the document. She said my mother would have wanted the truth to have a guardian, Alistair said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. And she said it was time for the ghosts of Blackwood Hall to be put to rest. We stood there for a long moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. The storm outside was a tempest, but in that room, a profound calm had settled. We had it. We had the truth, whole and undeniable. Lady Trowbridge was here, I said quietly, the words falling into the charged silence. Alistair's head snapped up, the triumphant light in his eyes instantly replaced by a cold, protective fury. When? 2 days ago, she pretended her carriage had broken down. She came to see if the rumors were true. What rumors? He demanded, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. That I was here, with you, alone. I met his gaze steadily. She came to gather evidence for a new scandal, Alistair. One that would ruin us both. A muscle worked in his jaw. What did you do? I was polite, I said, a small, grim smile touching my lips. I offered her tea and then returned to my work. Mrs. Gable handled her, but the story is out now. By the time we present this truth, society may have already condemned us for a different crime entirely. He was silent, his mind clearly working, assessing this new threat. He began to pace before the fire, a caged wolf in his own study. The weariness had fallen away, replaced by a sharp, dangerous energy. Then we will not give them time to pass judgment, he said, stopping abruptly. He looked at me, his eyes blazing with a new resolve. We will not answer their whispers in private. We will answer them in public. We will turn their own weapon against them. What are you planning? Lord Beaumont is hosting his annual summer gala in 3 days' time, he said, a predatory stillness coming over him. It is the highlight of the season. Everyone will be there. Lady Trowbridge will have spent the last 2 days ensuring every guest arrives primed with her story about us. He picked up the affidavit from the table. They will be expecting a scandal. We will give them one, just not the one they are anticipating. A thrill of fear and exhilaration shot through me. It was audacious, it was dangerous, it was perfect. They will not admit you, I pointed out. After what happened at the last ball, they will admit me, he said, a humorless smile twisting his lips. I am still the Duke of Ashworth. My credit is still good, and my influence, though I have not used it in years, is still considerable. Beaumont will not dare to have me thrown out. He came to stand before me, his presence filling my entire world. The question is, will you stand with me, Clara? It will be a public stage. 1,000 lights, 1,000 witnesses, just like before. But this time, we will be the ones to speak the truth. I looked from his intense, questioning face to the portrait of his mother above the mantel. Her serene gaze seemed to offer a silent blessing. She had been robbed of her voice, her memory twisted into a weapon against the innocent. This was not just my fight, it was hers. It was ours. If courage has a sound, I said, my voice low but clear, echoing the thought I'd had on that terrible night, it is the breath I take now. I met his gaze and my next words were a vow. I will stand with you. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it stole my breath. It was as if he had been holding a tension in his body for 20 years, and it had finally been released. He reached out, his hand gently cupping my cheek. His touch was not an anchor this time. It was a homecoming. Thank you, he whispered, his thumb stroking my skin. The simple gesture was more intimate, more binding than any kiss. It was a promise of partnership, of a shared future forged in the crucible of this fight. For the next 2 days, Blackwood Hall was transformed. It was no longer a house of ghosts and silence. It was a war room. Messengers were dispatched. Letters were written and sealed with the severe black wax of the Ashworth crest. Alistair's solicitor arrived from London, a dry, precise man with eyes that missed nothing. He examined the affidavit and Eleonora's final letter, his movements precise and deliberate, a general preparing his maps for a final, decisive battle. We did not speak of love or of the future or of the fragile, unspoken thing that was growing between us in the firelight. The fight was not yet won, and to name our hope before it had earned its place in the world felt like a betrayal of the task at hand. Our days were spent in his study. The dry solicitor, Mr. Davies, would read aloud from legal texts in a voice like rustling parchment, while Alistair listened, his expression intent, his mind weaving a strategy from the threads of law and honor. I sat nearby, Eleonora's diary open before me, not for evidence, but for courage. Her quiet strength seemed to seep from the pages, a steadying presence in the tense, waiting hours. On the second day, Alistair sent for a dressmaker from the village, a small, bird-like woman with clever hands and kind eyes. She took my measurements in silence, her gaze flickering between me and the portrait of Eleonora, a quiet understanding passing between us. His lordship was very specific, she murmured, pinning a length of silk against my shoulder. He said the color should be of the evening sky, just after the sun is set. Not black for morning, nor white for innocence, but a color that holds the promise of stars. The gown she created was a masterpiece of understated elegance. It was a deep, luminous gray blue, the fabric falling in a simple, clean line from the high waist to the floor. It had no lace, no frills, no gaudy embellishments. Its only adornment was a row of tiny jet-black buttons that ran down the back like a column of disciplined resolve. It was not a dress for a ball, it was armor. The night of the gala, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a world that smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. As I descended the grand staircase, Alistair was waiting for me in the hall. He had shed the somber clothes of his seclusion and was dressed in formal evening attire of severe black and stark white. He looked every inch the Duke of Ashworth, a man born to command, his years of quiet grief now forged into an unshakable strength. His eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw not just approval, but a profound, breathtaking respect. He did not offer a compliment. He simply held out his arm to me. I placed my hand upon it, and the warmth of him through the fine wool was a steady, grounding force. "Mrs. Gable," he said, turning to the housekeeper who stood near the door, a silent sentinel. "We will return before dawn." "Godspeed, my lord," she said, and for the first time I saw a flicker of raw emotion in her stoic eyes. She looked at me, and her gaze was a blessing. The carriage ride to London was silent. We sat across from each other, the space between us charged with all the things we could not yet say. The rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves on the road was a drumbeat, counting down the moments until the battle. As the city lights grew brighter, Alistair reached into his coat and withdrew a small, velvet-covered box. "My mother was not a woman for grand jewels," he said, his voice low, "but she had one piece she favored." He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded silk, was a ring. It was a simple band of gold, set with a single deep blue sapphire, the color of a midnight sea. She said it reminded her of the moment just before a storm breaks, when the world is full of a beautiful, dangerous energy. He did not offer it to me. He simply showed it to me, a shared secret, a piece of his mother's spirit he wanted me to carry with me into the fight. It was a gesture of trust so profound it made my heart ache. Beaumont House was a blaze of light, every window a golden eye staring out into the velvet darkness. The sound of music and laughter spilled out into the night, a careless, glittering sound that set my teeth on edge. As we stepped from the carriage, a hush fell over the guests who were gathered on the steps, their conversation faltering as they recognized the wolf's head crest, and then the man who had been a ghost in their society for years. Have you ever walked into a room where every smile is a dagger? We ascended the steps, and the whispers followed us like the rustle of dry leaves. Alistair's hand rested lightly on the small of my back, a silent, protective presence. We were announced at the ballroom door, our names dropping into the glittering assembly like stones into a still pond. His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, and Miss Vance. The music wavered, then stopped entirely. 1,000 conversations died. 1,000 pairs of eyes turned to us. The chandeliers, the same kind that had witnessed my humiliation, now burned with a cold, merciless light, illuminating us in the center of a vast, hostile silence. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the delicious thrill of their anticipated scandal. Lord Beaumont, his face a mask of jovial welcome that did not reach his eyes, hurried toward us. Lady Trowbridge was at his side, her expression a perfect blend of shock and vicious satisfaction. "Ashworth," Beaumont boomed, his voice too loud in the sudden quiet. "What an unexpected honor. We had thought you lost to us." "I have been occupied, Beaumont," Alistair replied, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily across the silent room. "I have been attending to a matter of old business, a debt of honor that has been left unpaid for far too long." Beaumont's smile tightened. "My dear fellow, this is hardly the time or place for business." "On the contrary," Alistair said, his gaze sweeping the room, holding the eyes of every guest in turn. "This is the perfect time and the perfect place, because this is a matter of public record, a story that began in this very room, with a lie." He took a step forward, and I with him. We were an island in a sea of silk and diamonds, a stark, quiet challenge to their glittering world. "Some of you were here several weeks ago," Alistair continued, his voice resonating with an authority they had forgotten he possessed. "You witnessed Lord Beaumont accuse this lady, Miss Vance, of forgery. He held up a letter, a supposed crime, and used it to destroy her reputation and her livelihood." A murmur went through the crowd. Lady Trowbridge whispered something in Beaumont's ear, her fan fluttering like a frantic bird's wing. "The accusation was a lie," Alistair stated, the words sharp and clean as steel. "A calculated cruelty designed to deflect attention from his own long history of deceit." "This is an outrage," Beaumont sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are mad, Ashworth. Grief has unhinged you. To come into my home and slander me with these wild accusations?" "Are they wild?" I asked, my own voice emerging, steadier than I could have hoped. The sound of it silenced Beaumont's blustering. I looked not at him, but at his wife, who stood behind him, her face pale and drawn. "Lady Beaumont, is it a wild accusation that your husband's unfortunate speculations have left your family in a state of financial distress for years?" Lady Beaumont flinched as if I had struck her. Her eyes, wide and frightened, darted to her husband, then away. Her silence was a confession. "The truth," Alistair said, drawing the affidavit from his coat, "is that 20 years ago, Lord Beaumont's father owed my father a significant debt. When my father refused to extend him further credit, Lord Beaumont's father attempted to blackmail him." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. This was a deeper, older scandal than they could have imagined. Beaumont's face, which had been a blotchy canvas of outrage, paled to a sickly white. The story was not about a disgraced companion. It was about the foundations of his own house, and they were rotten. "This is preposterous," he managed, his voice losing its booming confidence. "A fabrication, the ravings of a grieving son and a desperate woman." Alistair did not even grant him a glance. His attention was fixed on the assembly, his voice a steady, resonant force that commanded their absolute attention. The attempted blackmail failed. My father, a man of unbending honor, ordered him from the house. But the insult was not forgotten. The lie was not put to rest. It was simply kept in reserve, waiting for a new target. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the gilded silence. The letter that Miss Vance was accused of forging was not an imitation of her hand. It was a crude, vicious echo of a forgery Lord Beaumont's father attempted to use against my own mother 20 years ago. He chose Miss Vance as his victim not for any crime she committed, but because her quiet integrity was a mirror to my mother's. In his twisted mind, destroying her was a way of finally succeeding at a crime his father had failed to commit. The candles in the great chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, their light no longer a soft glow, but a harsh, interrogating glare. This was the third time I had stood beneath their light, judged. The first I was a suspect, the second a ghost. Now I was a witness to the truth that Alistair was laying bare for all to see. "I have here," Alistair said, holding up the affidavit, "the sworn testimony of Mrs. Albright, my mother's devoted lady's maid. She was a witness to the original confrontation. She heard every threat, every word of Beaumont's extortion." He unclasped the oilskin pouch and carefully withdrew the letter within. "And she was the keeper of this, the final letter my mother, Alistair Ashworth, ever wrote. A plea to my father not to let one man's dishonor poison their world." He held the letter aloft. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint crackle of the candle wicks. He did not read it aloud. He did not need to. The sight of it, the tangible proof of Eleanor's voice reaching across the years, was enough. It was a sacred object in a profane space, and its power was absolute. "This is not just about a forged letter," Alistair concluded, his gaze finally locking onto Beaumont. "This is about a generational sickness, a poison of ambition and deceit that has been passed from father to son. You did not just slander an innocent woman, Beaumont. You desecrated a memory. You used the ghost of my mother to wage your pathetic, cowardly war." Every face in the room was turned toward Lord Beaumont. There was no escape for him. The walls of his own ballroom had become the walls of a courtroom, and the verdict was being rendered in the silent, condemning stares of his peers. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked to his wife, a desperate, pleading glance, but she would not meet his eyes. She stood like a statue carved from ice, her face a mask of frozen misery. Then she did something small, something almost imperceptible, that sealed his fate. She took a single step back from him. It was not a grand gesture, but it was a definitive one. It was a separation, a severing of alliance. In that one tiny movement, she confirmed every word Alistair had said. A low murmur began to spread through the room, a tide of judgment turning. Lady Trowbridge, who had been standing near the Beaumonts, seemed to shrink into her elaborate gown. Her face had lost its vicious satisfaction, replaced by the pale, pinched look of someone who has backed the wrong horse in a race she thought was fixed. She began to edge away, melting into the crowd, her career as a chief gossip ending in a quiet, ignominious retreat. Alistair folded the documents with deliberate care and placed them back inside his coat. He had said all that needed to be said. He turned to me, his expression softening, and held out his arm. "Clara," he said, his voice for my ears alone, "let us go home." I placed my hand on his arm, and we turned our backs on the wreckage. We walked through the silent, parted sea of guests, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and a grudging, newfound respect. No one spoke. No one moved to stop us. We had not just won an argument, we had realigned their world. We had reminded them that honor was not just a word to be embroidered on a family crest, but a standard to be lived, and that the truth, however long it is buried, will always find its way to the light. As we stepped out into the cool, clean night air. The sound of the city seemed hushed, respectful. The moon was a sliver of silver in the inky sky. We descended the stone steps, leaving the house of 1,000 lights and 1,000 lies behind us. The door of the Ashworth carriage was opened by a waiting footman, and as Alistair handed me inside, I felt the last of the tension leave my body, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and an even more profound peace. The carriage ride back to Blackwood Hall was a journey through a quiet, dreamlike landscape. The city's gas lights gave way to the soft, scattered glow of village windows, and then to the deep, velvet darkness of the countryside. The rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves was a soothing, steady heartbeat. We sat not across from each other this time, but side by side, the space between us no longer charged with unspoken tension, but filled with a comfortable, shared silence. The storm had washed the world clean. The air through the open carriage window was cool and damp, smelling of wet earth and sleeping flowers. I watched the moonlit fields slide past, my mind replaying the scene in the ballroom, the faces, the silence, the final, undeniable triumph of the truth. We had done it. We had unmade the lie. "Are you all right?" Alistair asked, his voice a low rumble beside me in the dark. "I am," I said, and I was surprised by the simple truth of the words. "I feel as though I have been holding my breath for months, and I have only just now exhaled." He was silent for a moment. "My mother would have liked you," he said softly. "She valued courage, and she despised bullies." "She was a remarkable woman," I said, my hand instinctively going to my lap, where the memory of her diary felt imprinted. "Her love for you, for your father, it was in every word she wrote, even in her sorrow." "I had forgotten that," he confessed, his voice thick with an old grief. "After she died, my father's silence was so absolute, it was as if she had been erased. The only memory I allowed myself to keep was the one of her pain, of the injustice. I locked away the rest, the laughter, the garden, the light." He turned to me, his profile a stark, beautiful silhouette against the passing darkness. "You brought that back. You gave her back to me, Clara." His hand found mine in the space between us. His fingers were cool from the night air, but his grip was warm and firm. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, of a shared history, of a connection that had been forged in a crucible of lies and had emerged as something strong and true. We rode the rest of the way in silence, our hands clasped, two solitary souls who had found in each other a quiet harbor. Have you ever felt a silence that says more than any words could ever express? We arrived at Blackwood Hall as the first pearlescent hint of dawn was touching the eastern sky. The house stood dark and silent, a fortress at rest. As we stepped from the carriage, the air was still and cool, the ground soft beneath our feet. The world felt new, as if it had been born in the night. Instead of going inside, Alistair led me around the side of the house, toward the overgrown garden. The rain had left every leaf, every petal, beaded with diamond-like drops of water. The air was heavy with the scent of wet roses and damp earth. In the pale pre-dawn light, the tangled thicket of thorns and blooms looked less like a wilderness and more like a sanctuary. We walked the winding, overgrown paths, the wet grass hushing our footsteps. He led me to the heart of the garden, to a stone bench that sat beneath a wild arch of crimson roses. We sat, the cool stone a shock through the thin fabric of my gown. The sky was slowly turning from indigo to a soft, bruised purple. "I have not sat here since I was a boy," Alistair said, his gaze sweeping over the tangled beauty of the garden. "After she died, I could not bear it. It felt like a betrayal to see all this life, all this beauty, continuing on without her." He looked at me, his winter gray eyes clear and deep in the growing light. "But now I see it differently. This garden is not a monument to what was lost. It is a testament to what endures." He reached into his coat and withdrew the small velvet box. He did not open it immediately. He held it in his palm, his expression thoughtful. "For 20 years, this house has been a tomb. I have been a ghost within it. I thought that by locking the world out, I could protect the memory of what I had lost. But all I did was starve what was left of my own heart." He opened the box. The sapphire on his mother's ring caught the first rays of the rising sun, and it glowed with a deep internal fire. "You walked into my house of ghosts, Clara, and you were not afraid. You brought order to my chaos. You brought courage to my grief. You brought light into my darkness. You made this house a home again. He took my hand, his touch gentle. I am not the man my father was. I cannot offer you a world of glittering balls and easy smiles. My world is here, in these quiet halls, in this wild garden. It is a world that is in need of tending. He slid the sapphire ring onto my finger. It fit as if it were made for me. I am asking you to be my wife, Clara. I am asking you to share this quiet world with me, to help me tend to its ghosts and its gardens, to be the guardian of this house, not as an employee, but as its heart, as my heart. The sun had crested the horizon, and its golden light spilled through the thorny arch of roses, catching the fire and the sapphire on my finger. The world held its breath. The birds in the ancient trees were silent. All of creation seemed to be waiting for my answer. Tears I did not know I had been holding pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy, a release of a pain I had carried for so long I had forgotten its weight. I looked from the ring on my hand to the earnest, vulnerable face of the man before me, the recluse, the ghost, the Duke of Ashworth, Alistair. I once thought courage was the breath you take before you lose everything, I said, my voice soft in the morning stillness. But I was wrong. Courage is the breath you take when you have everything to gain. I met his gaze, and my answer was in my eyes before it was on my lips. Yes, I whispered. Yes, Alistair, I will. He did not kiss me. He did something far more intimate. He closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of profound relief washing over his features. And then he raised my hand to his lips, pressing a gentle, reverent kiss to the ring he had just placed there. He then rose and drew me to my feet and stood before me, simply holding both of my hands in his. He rested his forehead against mine, and we stood there, two solitary souls no longer alone, breathing the same cool, rose-scented air as the sun rose on the first day of our new life. We walked back to the house as the world was waking, the stones of the path still damp with dew. The light was golden now, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners of the severe, beautiful house. It no longer looked like a fortress. It looked like a home waiting to be filled. Mrs. Gable was standing just inside the open front door. She had not been waiting up, but she had risen with the dawn, as was her custom. Her face was, as always, a mask of disciplined composure. But as her gaze fell upon our clasped hands, and then to the sapphire on my finger, a subtle softening occurred around her eyes. She did not offer congratulations. Her approval was a quieter, more profound thing. She simply gave a single sharp nod and then turned to the side table in the hall. I will have a fresh pot of tea sent to the morning room, Your Grace, she said, her voice the same starched, flat tone as always. And for you, my lady. The title, so simply and correctly spoken, hung in the air. It was a statement of fact, an acceptance of a new reality. The house had given its blessing. The days that followed were a quiet unfolding. The world outside our gates was in an uproar. Letters arrived daily from Alistair's solicitor, Mr. Davies, detailing the complete and utter collapse of Lord Beaumont's world. His credit was ruined, his social standing annihilated. He was a pariah. We learned through a discreet postscript that Lady Beaumont had quietly removed herself and her personal fortune to a distant cousin's estate in the north, severing all ties with her husband. His ruin was absolute, a self-inflicted wound brought to light. We read the news not with triumph, but with a somber sense of justice served. The lie had been unmade, and its architect had been consumed by it. But within the walls of Blackwood Hall, a gentle transformation was taking place. The library, once a magnificent tomb, became a shared project. We worked side by side, sorting through the centuries of paper and ink. The silence was no longer heavy with grief, but filled with the soft rustle of turning pages, the scratch of my pen as I catalogued the collection, and the low murmur of Alistair's voice as he would occasionally read aloud a passage he found particularly amusing or profound. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer haunting the halls. They were sleeping peacefully between the leather-bound covers of their own stories. I took to the garden. I did not try to tame it. That would have been a desecration of Eleanor's spirit. Instead, with the help of a grizzled old gardener who had worked for Alistair's father and remembered his mother with a fierce, protective loyalty, we began to tend to it. We cleared the choking weeds, pruned the dead wood, and gave the wild, resilient roses room to breathe and thrive. We found forgotten stone paths and uncovered a small, lily-choked pond. It was a work of patient restoration, of honoring the wild beauty that had endured through years of neglect. One afternoon, about a month after the night of the ball, I was in the garden, my hands covered in dirt, a smudge of earth on my cheek, when Alistair came looking for me. He was carrying a letter, but his expression was one I had not seen before. It was a look of quiet, profound satisfaction, a joy so deep it seemed to radiate from him. This came for the hand was Lord Alistair Ashworth's. I knew it without looking, the way one knows the feel of coming rain or the stillness before a storm. He was a man made of winter and silence, a recluse who had not been seen in London society for years, and his sudden appearance at Lord Beaumont's annual ball was a mystery that had set every tongue to wagging. His touch was not a comfort, not yet. It was an anchor, a quiet, firm pressure at my wrist that kept me from floating away on the sea of accusation that was rising around me. "Miss Vance!" Lord Beaumont's voice, usually so full of false bonhomie, was sharp as shattered glass. He stood on the raised dais, a letter held aloft in his hand. The candlelight glinted on the broken wax seal, a small red wound. "A most unfortunate discovery has been made this evening. A matter of a forged correspondence, leading to a significant financial decision on my part." He did not need to name me. Every eye in that gilded ballroom, from the dowagers on the settees to the young ladies by the punch bowl, turned to me. I was the humble companion to his wife, the daughter of a merchant whose recent misfortunes were common gossip. I was the perfect suspect, a weed in their immaculate garden. The whispers grew from a murmur to a hiss, the sound of silk and condemnation. Liar, forger, thief. Have you ever felt the world shrink to the size of a single damning word? My own breath caught, a knot of ice in my throat. My father's honor, my own future. All of it was unraveling under the weight of 1,000 glittering chandeliers. I could feel the heat on my cheeks, the cold dread coiling in my stomach. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to declare my innocence. But what good would it do? My word against his, in his home, surrounded by his world. It was then that Lord Ashworth moved. He did not speak, did not challenge Lord Beaumont. He simply stepped forward, placing himself partially in front of me, a subtle shield of black wool and unyielding presence. He inclined his head toward the French doors that led to the terrace. It was not a command, but an offering, an escape. I took it, my feet moving numbly across the polished floor as he escorted me from the room, the collective gasp of the assembly following us like a wave. Outside, the cool night air was a mercy. The scent of rain-washed roses from the Beaumont's manicured gardens filled my lungs. He released my wrist, and the absence of his touch left me feeling strangely adrift. He still had not spoken a word to me. His profile was carved from granite in the moonlight, his expression unreadable. "My lord," I managed, my voice a raw whisper, "I do not know how to thank you, or why you would—" "I have no interest in Beaumont's parlor games," he said, his voice a low baritone, rough around the edges as if from disuse. "And I have even less interest in witnessing a public execution." He looked at me then, his eyes a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky. They held no pity, only a keen, unnerving assessment. "You should leave, now, before his wife remembers her duty and has you thrown out." He was right. My position, my life in this house was over. He turned and walked away without another word, melting back into the shadows of the terrace as if he had never been there at all. I was left alone with the ruins of my reputation and the scent of roses I could no longer appreciate. By morning, I was dismissed. Lady Beaumont, her face a mask of pained disappointment, could not even meet my eyes as she instructed the butler to see me out. I packed my single trunk, my hands shaking as I folded the simple gowns that felt like the uniform of a life that no longer belonged to me. My father, when I sent him a frantic note, wrote back in a script made unsteady by despair. He believed me, but his belief was a candle in a hurricane. Lord Beaumont's accusation had already done its work, closing doors throughout the city. No one would hire a companion, a governess, a secretary with the stain of forgery upon her name. For a week I lived in a haze of fear, my meager savings dwindling with each passing day. I sat in my small rented room, watching the rain streak down the window pane, each drop a reflection of my own unshed tears. The city felt like a prison, every carriage that passed a potential bearer of more bad news. I was trapped with no recourse and no hope. Then the letter came. It was delivered by a private courier, a single heavy sheet of cream parchment, sealed with a severe black wax crest. A wolf's head, the sigil of the House of Ashworth. My heart hammered against my ribs as I broke the seal. The handwriting within was bold and spare, as uncompromising as the man himself. It was not a letter of condolence or an offer of charity. It was a proposal of employment. Lord Ashworth required an archivist to catalog the extensive and notoriously disorganized library of his late father. The work, he stated, would be arduous and would require absolute discretion. I would reside at his country estate, Blackwood Hall, and my duties would be confined to the library and its adjacent chambers. He would expect no social interaction. The salary he offered was more than generous. It was a lifeline. A choice was before me: to remain in London and starve with my tattered dignity, or to accept a position that felt suspiciously like a gilded cage, offered by a man who was a complete enigma. I chose the cage. What, after all, did I have left to lose? 2 days later, a carriage bearing the same wolf's head crest collected me and my trunk. We left the smog and whispers of London behind, traveling north into a landscape of rolling hills and ancient forests. As the carriage turned onto a long, winding drive, I caught my first glimpse of Blackwood Hall. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a severe, beautiful house of dark gray stone, flanked by 2 imposing wings, its many windows like watchful eyes. The house seemed to rise from the mist-shrouded earth, more fortress than home. The gardens, unlike the pristine beds at the Beaumont residence, were wild and overgrown. Roses grew in tangled thickets, their thorny branches reaching like desperate arms. It was a place that had given up on being tamed. A woman as severe as the house itself met me at the door. Her name was Mrs. Gable, and her face was a roadmap of disciplined sorrows. She did not smile. She simply acknowledged my existence with a curt nod. "Miss Vance, his lordship is not in residence today. He left instructions." Her voice was starched, every word ironed flat. "Your duties are confined to the library wing. Your meals will be brought to your rooms. You are not to wander." It was the welcome of a jailer, not a housekeeper. I followed her through a great hall where the portraits of past Ashworths watched from the shadows, their painted eyes seeming to track my every move. The air was cold, still, and smelled of beeswax, old stone, and something else, a faint lingering scent of rain on dry earth. We ascended a wide, curving staircase, our footsteps the only sound in the suffocating silence. "His lordship values his privacy above all else," Mrs. Gable continued, as if sensing my unspoken questions. "He will not be disturbed. You will likely not see him at all. Your instructions for the library are on the desk in your study." My study was a small antechamber connected to the main library, furnished with a sturdy desk, a single chair, and a narrow cot in an adjoining room. It was monastic, but clean. A single tall window looked out over the back of the house, offering a view of the tangled rose garden. The thorns were more prominent than the blooms, a thicket of beautiful, dangerous things left to their own devices. It felt like a reflection of the master of the house himself. Then she opened the door to the library, and I forgot to breathe. It was not one room, but a cathedral of books. 2 stories high, with a gallery running along the upper level, it was a magnificent, heartbreaking chaos. Books were stacked on every surface, spilling from shelves, piled in corners, their spines cracked and their pages whispering with dust. Sunlight, thick with dancing motes, streamed through a high, arched window, illuminating the beautiful disarray. It was the tomb of a great mind, a treasure left to ruin. The task was not arduous, it was biblical. For 3 days I saw no one but the young maid who silently delivered my meal trays. I spent my hours in that vast, quiet room, a castaway on an island of paper and ink. I began by simply walking the perimeter, trying to grasp the scale of the collection. History, philosophy, poetry in a dozen languages, scientific treatises, and endless rows of estate ledgers. It was the history of a family, a legacy in leather and vellum. On the fourth day, while clearing a high shelf of what appeared to be agricultural records, my fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. It was not a book. Tucked behind a row of dull brown ledgers was a small box made of polished rosewood, inlaid with a mother-of-pearl initial, a single elegant E. It was locked and far too personal to be part of a formal collection. It felt like a secret. I placed it on a nearby table, my curiosity a small bright spark in the dusty silence. That evening I worked late, driven by a need to impose some small order on the chaos as if it might bring order to my own life. The library was cavernous in the dark, the small pool of my candlelight a fragile defense against the encroaching shadows. The house was utterly still. Have you ever been in a silence so profound you can hear the beating of your own heart? A floorboard creaked on the gallery above me. I froze, my hand hovering over a page. I was not alone. I looked up into the darkness, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows at the top of the stairs. It was Lord Ashworth. He descended without a sound, his movements fluid and silent. He was not dressed for society now. He wore simple dark trousers and a linen shirt, unbuttoned at the throat. He looked younger, less formidable, and profoundly weary. The weight of the silence in his house seemed to rest on his shoulders. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the books around us. "You keep late hours. The work requires it, my lord." My voice was steadier than I felt. "The collection is extensive. My father was a man of compulsive intellect and zero organizational skill," he stated, his gaze sweeping the room. There was no apology in his tone, only a flat statement of fact. His eyes, those winter gray eyes, came to rest on me. "You have not been disturbed?" "No, my lord. Mrs. Gable has been most efficient." An almost imperceptible softening occurred around his mouth, not quite a smile, but a lessening of tension. "She is a fortress, and loyal." His gaze drifted to the table where I had been working, and he saw the rosewood box. I saw